Hi, and welcome back to GCSE History lessons. In this lesson, we will examine the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the Truman Doctrine and understand the reasons for and reactions to the Marshall Plan. You should remember from previous lessons that Europe was divided between capitalist nations in the West and communist nations in the East, with Germany and Berlin divided similarly into Eastern and Western zones. You will also remember that in his long telegram, George Kennan explained that the USSR intended to spread its influence and ideology of communism, and that the US should contain the USSR wherever it sought to expand. Meanwhile, in Novikov's telegram to Moscow, the US was perceived as aggressively spreading capitalism throughout the world. You should also remember that Clement Attlee replaced Churchill as leader of the UK in July 1945, and that Attlee began to socialise the UK in order to pay for and rebuild its destroyed post-war economy. So Truman received the long telegram in February 1946, just as Britain's Labour government was attempting to rebuild its broken economy after years of war. Without the ability to maintain its global empire or European interests in Turkey or Greece, Britain retreated as a European presence. Truman had already decided that the US would play a larger role in Europe as Britain continued to recede. And in August 1946, he had said, "The time has come when we must decide that we should resist with all means at our disposal any Soviet aggression." So, fearing the USSR would step in to fill the void left by Britain, he was forced into action when Attlee announced that the UK would stop aid payments to Greece and Turkey. In 1947, he doubled down on his promise that the US would be the protector of the West. During the same speech to Congress in which he had painted the world in black and white, evil totalitarianism and good democracy, Truman said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." Although not specifically mentioning the USSR, it was clear that Truman's doctrine would be one of resisting any Soviet attempt to influence politics or gain power around the world. Thus, the suggestions of George Kennan in his long telegram were transformed into the foreign policy of the US during Truman's presidency. The strategy of countering the USSR wherever it sought to expand its influence became known as containment. This was the Truman Doctrine in a nutshell, and it had a negative effect on US-Soviet relations, especially since the USSR already saw the USA as aggressive. It was against this tense backdrop that the leaders of the USSR, UK, USA, and France met in Moscow to decide the fate of Germany. Despite holding 43 meetings over 7 weeks, they could not agree on a solution to the German problem. It was suspected that Stalin saw no benefit to himself in allowing Germany to be reunified while he was still extracting reparations from East Germany. For him, the best strategy was to leave matters as they were. France also strongly opposed reunification, with the two world wars against Germany fresh in the memories of most French, including their leader Charles de Gaulle. US Secretary of State George C. Marshall suggested that Stalin was deliberately allowing Europe to suffer in poverty and ruin because this was the kind of crisis communism thrived on. So Marshall came up with a plan to speed up European recovery. With the US the only nation with the funds and willingness to invest in rebuilding Europe, Marshall announced on June 5, 1947, that if the European countries created a plan for recovery, the United States would offer its support. The Soviets were invited, and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov brought with him more than 100 delegates from Russia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia to the European meetings in Paris at the end of June, where Europe would make their recovery plan. But Stalin was not so happy about signing his satellite states up to a recovery program overseen by the United States, and he did not want to accept a reduction in German reparations. He saw the Marshall Plan as a challenge to his sphere of influence, with the United States trying to infiltrate the economies of the East, just as Novikov had predicted in his 1946 telegram. Molotov and his delegation walked out of the conference on July 3rd. After lengthy debates in the American Congress, The Marshall Plan was approved, and over the next 4 years, $13 billion in US aid flowed into Western Europe. At the same time, Stalin extracted the same amount from Eastern Europe. So, to summarize what we've learned today, the Truman Doctrine was the strategy of the USA to stand up to the USSR wherever it attempted to expand its power. The Truman Doctrine was explained during the President's address to Congress on March 12, 1947. The Truman Doctrine was built off George Kennan's long telegram in which he suggested that the best way to deal with the USSR was the strategy of containment. The Truman Doctrine heightened tensions between the USA and USSR. It confirmed Soviet fears, explained in the Novikov telegram, that the USA was hostile to the USSR and wished to undermine it. It added to the rhetoric of a bipolar world split between good and evil. The Marshall Plan, announced on June 5, 1947, was the plan to spend billions of US dollars to rebuild Europe. Discussions about the reunification of Germany failed to reach an outcome, and the US Secretary of State George Marshall feared communism would thrive if Europe remained devastated from the war. The withdrawal of British aid from Greece and Turkey sparked fears in the USA that Stalin would step in to fill the gap left by the UK. This forced the USA into action. Marshall invited all European countries to make a plan which the USA would support, but suspecting the USA was trying to infiltrate his sphere of influence, Stalin refused to allow Eastern European nations to join the plan. The Marshall Plan further divided Europe both politically and economically, and secured the USA as the patron of Western Europe. Next lesson, we will take a look at the Berlin Crisis of 1948 to 1949. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.